Well, welcome once again to the Schaefer monthly lectures. I have had a lot of fun with this one. I've got some books over there, and the one on the left nearly killed me, but because it's an 800-page biography of John Paul that was written in 1999, and he lived for another 6 years. So there's a second volume with 500 pages. To get the last part, I'm going. But I learned a lot. So I had to be very selective about how much of the information I'm going to present tonight. I think I've got it organized to help you understand who this guy was. There was a lot of things that I did not know about him. A lot of you look like you are of my generation or close, and you have your own memories of what his life was like and how it impacted the world. But the reason I'm picking the topics that I have picked for this summer series is because in teaching my high school students every year, it has, over the last couple of years, become increasingly clear that they don't know anything about the last half of the 20th century. They don't know who Pope John Paul was. They don't know who Ronald Reagan was. They don't know who Margaret Thatcher was. And then they certainly don't know who Lech Walesa or Anatoly Sharansky or Sakharov or Václav Havel. I want to talk about all of them. In fact, I'm thinking about doing just the dissidents in Eastern Europe for the 3 lectures in the fall. But for the rest of the summer, so July, August, September, I am going to do the Pope, the Prime Minister, and the President, because unfortunately, people don't know the history. So, Karol Wojtyla. I also figured out why his nickname is Lolek. I knew his nickname was Lolek. I had no idea why. I was going, how do you get from Karol, which is a boy's name in Poland, to Lolek? Well, it turns out the diminutive is of Karol in Polish is Karolek. So Karolek then is shortened to Lolek. And that's what his students referred to him as. They referred to him as either Lolek or Uncle. And I'll talk about why they would do that and not call him Father Wojtyla. Oh, and the pronunciation of his last name. So the J is pronounced like a Y, and the L with the little diagonal through it is a W sound. So it's Wojtyła. Wojtyła. The T-Y is Wojtyła. Karol Lolek Wojtyła, a.k.a. Pope John Paul II. So, welcome. Yes, this is a Schaefer Study Center lecture. And yeah, here's a few more pictures of him. Here he is with Pope Paul VI after he had been elevated to Bishop of Krakow in 1968. I have memories of 1968. There he is with Pope John Paul I in September of 1978, and 1 month later as Pope John Paul II. That's his official Vatican portrait when he was elected as Pope. So, a little introduction about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, because some people will be watching this video trying to figure out if I'm a heretical Protestant or a crypto-Catholic or whatever. So for those of you that are wondering, no, I remain an elder at Abundant Life Church, but I will confess my admiration for John Paul II up front, and I hope you'll understand why as we go through the details. The Francis Schaeffer Study Center sponsors these lectures, founded in 2004, and the mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And we deliberately chose the name from Francis Schaeffer, who was an influential theologian and apologist in the late 20th century. I hate saying that phrase. Yeah, the late 20th century. So in addition to sponsoring this lecture series, the Schaeffer Study Center offers a high school program. It's built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. We begin with the ancient world in 9th grade. We finish with the 20th century in 12th grade. And we're going to have to amend that and at least start talking a little bit about the 21st century. And yes, married for 48 years, although next month we will celebrate our 7x7 anniversary, 7 groups of 7 years. Cindy and I have 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters. We have 22 grandchildren so far. And yes, I have a spreadsheet with all the birthdays because I have to. My education is as a historian. My BA is in history and German. My MA is in history and humanities. And I have been reading history all of my life and teaching for most of it. I've had a few little rabbit trails off and a few other things along the way, but I'm back to doing my first love, which is teaching history. So, help me get started. Tell me something, some of you will remember him, something you already know about Pope John Paul II. I had fun finding pictures. Anybody have memories?
They're all positive.
They're all positive. Okay, there's a reason for that.
Very charismatic.
Very charismatic. Yeah. He almost pursued a career in acting. He was actually trained and starred in a number of productions. Starting in high school, he was acting on the stage, and then in his university days, and he kind of had to choose. And some of his friends in the theater were very upset, and they tried to talk him out of pursuing ordination as a priest. So he comes by some of that charisma from his years as an actor. He also wrote plays. Yeah, and we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, well, primary sources. We have an embarrassment of riches because he's a 20th century guy. We have a lot of his own writings, a lot of letters that he sent and diaries that he kept. He wrote poetry and play. He wrote poetry sometime, this is a funny story, at the Vatican II Council. 2,000 bishops from all around the world. It's an ecumenical council. It's like in the tradition of Nicaea and Ephesus. For 3 years, they met in Rome. We know he wrote poetry on the margin of some of the papers about the council. He's a prolific author. He wrote philosophical and theological works for most of his life, and the encyclicals that were delivered during his papacy were drafted by him. He often sent the drafts out for his friends to read and review and offer suggestions, but he was the author. And so there are a lot of documents from his papal years. The official archives, the Catholic University of Lublin, where he was a professor for 20 years, and we'll talk a bit more about that. The Archdiocese of Krakow in southern Poland, and then, of course, the Vatican Archives. And most of that is open for scholars to research. Lots of testimonies, lots of oral history, photographs, audio, and video. He made journeys to 129 countries from 1979 to 2001 and was just followed very closely by the press. There's all sorts of documentation, all sorts of video of his speeches and the crowds that greeted him everywhere he went. In terms of secondary sources, well, I mentioned George Weigel. Weigel began writing while he was still alive. He met with the Pope. Weigel's a Catholic, also had been a reporter for many years, had covered Rome. He got what really amounts to unprecedented access. The Pope told all of his associates, if this guy wants to meet with you, meet with him and answer any questions that he has. And he met regularly with John Paul for really almost 10 years. He had sort of a standing once a month. Although he's very careful to note in the beginning, the agreement they had at the beginning was that the Pope would not have any preview of the finished work and would not have any editorial input. So it's an independent biography. And he is critical of the Pope at a number of interesting points, but clearly somebody who also admires him and someone who knew him. And as I say, he did a second volume 5 years after John Paul II died to cover those last 5 years of his papacy. There is a Polish author. I have not read this one. He did a biography in 1995. I think Weigel quotes him extensively. He went back and researched many of the sources from John Paul II's childhood and early career in Poland. Carl Bernstein, of all people, did a biography of John Paul II in 1996, and that date is important because it was after some of the most monumental events of his papacy. But it's Karl Bernstein, and Bernstein doesn't understand him because he doesn't share the worldview of the Roman Catholic world or even of the Christian world. So the Bernstein, I flipped through it a little bit. I decided I was going to devote my time to the Weigel because Weigel understands John Paul really from the inside in a way that's almost unique. Then John O'Sullivan did a wonderful book called The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister. That's when I read 20 years ago when it came out and kind of inspired what I'm doing here. And I did consult that. I'll be using more and more of that in the next 2 lectures. And then more recently, just 9 years ago, Paul Kinger did a book called A Pope and a President that explores the friendship between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. They actually became very good friends in the 80s. And no, there was no grand conspiracy where, they were on the phone to each other all the time. They met about a dozen times, and they clearly admired each other and were in broad agreement about what they thought the direction of the political structures of the world should be. Reagan was not interested in containment anymore from 1980 on. That had been the foreign policy of the U.S. was to contain communism, contain the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan said, nope, we're going to roll it back. And John Paul II was on the same page. We'll talk about that as well. So we're going to do this in 5 acts, as is my wont. I like structuring things like a good play. His early life and education, his early years as a priest, a chaplain, and a scholar in Poland. I'm still, more and more, every biography I tackle, every famous person that I investigate, I am always convinced of the truth of Wordsworth's observation: the child is the father of the man. If you want to understand an adult, find out about their childhood. So I want to talk a bit about what John Paul II's life was like in his earliest years, and especially in his university years. And then this Act 2 is sort of after the end of World War II, when he is ordained a priest in 1946, and what his career as a Catholic priest looked like in the 40s and 50s. And then in 1958, he moves from being a parish priest and a chaplain to being a bishop. And that's a different task, a different level of responsibility. And but he continues as an academic, as a theologian. He does that for 20 years. So he has another career. So if he's 12 years as a parish priest, he's 20 years as a bishop. And then lightning strikes. In 1978, it is the year of 3 popes. It's a highly unusual year, very significant. I'll talk about that and how we wound up with the first non-Italian pope in 450 years. Every pope for the previous 4.5 centuries had been an Italian bishop. And all of a sudden, we have a pope who's not an Italian bishop. And I'll talk a bit about why and then what the implications of that were. And then I'm going to talk about his papacy, the long papacy, one of the longer ones in the history of the papacy, 1978 to 2005. So 27 years he is pope. And I've kind of sorted it down to what I think are sort of 3 main periods. 1978 to 1990, I believe you should think of him as the liberator. He thought of himself that way. 1990 to 1999, he's a teacher, but he is the head of the church. He's constantly writing and publishing, just an incredible output of theological and practical ethical works. And then the last 5 years, his health began to fail. You can see it in the pictures very vividly. He's still doing his best to keep up a travel schedule, but clearly it's a huge task and toilsome and weary. The suffering witness, he dies in April of 2005, and we'll talk just a little bit about that. So that's where we're going. Let me get my, you know what it means when a pastor puts his watch on the podium, as Larry is fond of saying. Nothing, absolutely nothing. No, I'm going to hold it to an hour. I really am. Which means I have to leave a lot out. I can't do 1,500 pages in an hour. There's a lot of stuff I'm not going to say. He grew up in Wadowice in southern Poland. It's kind of a medium-sized town. His father was a retired Army officer. His mother was a school teacher. He's born in May of 1920. He had two siblings. He was the youngest of three children, but the oldest child, a brother, was 14 years older than he was 14 when Karol was born. So Karol knew him almost as the third adult in the household, and his older sister had died in infancy. So, and his mother died when he was 8, before his 9th birthday, and his older brother died when he was 12. And he and his father then had a very strong bond with each other. And his memories of his father and the memories of everyone who knew the family were that his father was a little bit aloof, a little bit what you would expect from a retired military officer, but also known for his integrity and his piety and his prayer life. That and John Paul, Karol, Lolek, said he constantly arose in the morning to discover that his father was already at a table with his head bowed in prayer. Interestingly, his father was a retired Army officer in the Austro-Hungarian Army, because Poland had disappeared from the European geography for over 150 years. From the early 1800 to 1920, Poland had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So his father had served as an officer in the Austrian army before his retirement, but he did have a pension. Even after the reestablishment of the nation of Poland, the Austrian government honored their obligations to all of their retired officers. In 1938, at 18, young man, now the only son of his, and with his father, the two of them moved together from Wadowice to Krakow, because Krakow is where the university was. Really one of the top universities in Poland, one of the top universities in all of Europe. It is a medieval university in its founding. It has a long history. It goes back almost as old as Oxford or the Sorbonne in Paris. It's, interestingly enough, it's the university where Copernicus studied and got his degree. So, the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and he enrolled and began a study of Polish literature and philology, which meant learning languages and learning the history of languages and reading the history of the literature written in Polish primarily. And one of his favorite books, one of his father's favorite books, was by one of the only Polish authors to win the Nobel Prize before the 1920s, Sienkiewicz, who wrote Quo Vadis, which became popular in translation in English and was made into a movie. He had a passion for theater, poetry, and language at 18. It was just obvious. And he had a real knack for languages. He wound up fluent in at least 8 or 9 languages, including Polish, French, German, English, Italian, Latin, and Russian. He's a pretty astonishing guy. All right, the Crucible. Yeah, I think these are the critical years in terms of forming who he was. Because here he is, a brand new university student, just completed his first year, picked his major, started his studies, and already doing very well. By the way, he's valedictorian of his high school class. And a lot of his high school classmates remember him still very fondly. He was not aloof. He also played goalie on the soccer team. And there were pickup soccer games all the time. There was a Jewish community in Wadowice, and the Jewish soccer players had their own team, but they didn't have a goalie. So Lolek would play goalie for the Jewish team against his friends in the pickup games. Anyway, his sophomore year, 1939, the Nazi invasion and occupation of Poland. And it's not just that his country was conquered. He and his father fled early. The war only lasted 2 or 3 weeks. They first fled eastward to try and get away from the German armies in hopes that they would be halted and that Poland would preserve at least some independent region. But then the Russians came in on as well. They went back to Krakow. The Nazis, after they occupied Krakow, called a meeting of the faculty and arrested all 138 professors and sent them to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where most of them died. So the university was, in the blink of an eye, wiped out. However, the graduate students and the undergrads organized and reconstituted the university as an underground secret university. They met in apartments. They met scattered around the town. They met at odd hours, odd nights, and he continued his studies in secret. Now, in order to avoid being forcibly drafted for labor details by the occupying, he had to show that he already had a job, that he was already working. So he took a job for a Solvay chemical factory, chemical work. The first job he took was in a quarry mining limestone, which was one of the ingredients for the chemical process. And then after a few months, he got transferred into the chemical factory. It was very hard physical labor. The other factory workers apparently took some pity on him. There were several other university students who were in the same predicament and kind of covered for them. And Lolek and his friends would sort of sneak off into a corner and read their books while other people covered and did their jobs for them. But it gave him an appreciation for manual labor and for the blue-collar workforce and an identification with them. He admired the people he was working with. They were all chafing under the Nazi occupation. He also joined an underground theater troupe. It was also illegal. Cultural and spiritual resistance to Nazi rule. And they rehearsed at odd hours of the night, after curfew, after blackout, and they would stage performances in apartments, sometimes to small audiences of 3 to 5 people. But they put on plays, they performed Shakespeare, they performed Polish plays, and Lolek wrote several plays that they staged in these little underground theater experiments. He honed his communication skills, his love of drama, and he thought, and most of his friends thought, that he would have a career as an actor. But after his father's death in 1941, his life took a turn. He became more and more interested. He fell under the influence of small, local, underground spiritual groups, clubs, Bible study. We would call them cell groups, and became increasingly interested in exploring the teachings of the Catholic Church and exploring the mystical disciplines and the prayer life of many of the medieval monastic writers and leaders. He's now completely alone, and he felt a call to the priesthood. He believed God was calling him to enter holy orders. He went and presented himself to the Archbishop of Krakow. And of course, the seminary was illegal as well. The Nazis would not allow the Catholic Church to openly conduct classes or to train anyone in theology. And so the Archbishop was running a clandestine seminary in his residence and sheltering the candidates, actually had to hide them in the dungeons occasionally when the Gestapo came by and conducted searches. And that would be Archbishop Sapieha, who became a father figure and who clearly believed that Karol Wojtyla had great things ahead of him. He believed that Wojtyla was someone who should be encouraged in his spiritual vocation, but also in his academic pursuits. And so he became a mentor, and Wojtyla became the protege of the Archbishop. There were only 2 archbishops in Poland, the Archbishop of Warsaw and the Archbishop of Krakow. The Nazis had banned seminaries, so his theological formation happened in secret under constant threat of arrest. Other seminary students were detected and shot, executed on the street. And so, you know, he's living a life under threat of death every day for what he's doing. He's doing factory work by day and secret theological studies at night and hiding in the residence of the Archbishop. In his 19, 20, 21, 22, till he's 26. He's 6 years under Nazi rule. This is his life. He's ordained a priest on November 1st, 1946, just after, the year after the war ended. And immediately the Archbishop says, you need to pursue a further university degree. He had completed an undergraduate degree at the secret university that was recognized. And the Archbishop said, I want you to go to Rome and do a 2-year doctorate in theology, which he does. And of course, Rome, 1946 to 1948, Rome was recovering from World War II. But he went. He came back. Here he is, the newly minted doctor of theology, and the Archbishop assigned him to a rural parish to work for a year. No electricity, no running water, no paved roads, and he learned the names of every member of the parish, and he visited every household. He took his responsibilities as a parish priest very seriously, and it marks something about him which I think becomes a hallmark, in that he is very focused on spiritual formation and mentorship and discipleship, and on forming small groups and communities. And he believes in the primacy of love and kindness and mutual support. The Archbishop then calls him back after having, the Archbishop is doing this deliberately. The Archbishop calls him back after a year to Krakow and appoints him as the priest chaplain to the university students at the now reconstituted university. And he is immediately wildly popular. Former chaplains had basically seen their responsibility as just to perform religious service to which the students could attend. So there's a mass on Wednesday and on Sunday, and the university students can come if they like, and the chaplain then basically doesn't have any other official responsibilities. Not Karol, not Lolek. He went and lived with the students. He brought students into his own apartment. He traveled with them. He organized small groups for Bible study and prayer that met every day of the week. And he organized trips. He took them on hiking trips and kayaking expeditions. He took them skiing. He did discussion groups in the mountains. They would be skiing by day, and at night they would sit around and debate Thomas Aquinas. They were not just recreation. And one of the reasons he had to do this is the communist state was not much better than the Nazi state. The communist state was militantly atheist and militantly trying to eliminate the church, made it illegal for Catholic priests to actually travel outside their parish or their church, or teach any religious classes, do any religious instruction outside of the church building. So he says, oh, we're not doing any religious instruction, we're going on a hike. We're not doing any religious instruction, we're going kayaking. And he created safe spaces for young people to talk about faith, philosophy, and life. He has a doctorate in theology, and he's soon to work on a doctorate in philosophy as well. But these students loved him. And in order to not betray him to the communists, if they had referred to him as Father Wojtyla, which would be the ordinary address for a parish priest, they switched to calling him Uncle. So he became Uncle Wojtyla, or Uncle Lolek. Because here he is, 25, 26, into his late 20s, but he's running around with all these university students, and then later also high school students, and he's Uncle Wojtyla. They called him, uncle in Polish is wujek Karol. He became a trusted mentor. He listened to their struggles. He balanced this with academic work. He became a coach and a tutor. He earned a second doctorate in philosophy, began teaching ethics and moral philosophy at the Catholic University of Lublin. Now, Lublin's in the north, Krakow is in the south. For some strange reason, the communist government could never find a suitable residence that would allow him to move to Lublin. They just kept saying, there are no open apartments. You'll have to stay where you are. We can't find any new housing for you. So he commuted. He taught usually 2 or 3 days a week in Lublin, and then he would commute back to Krakow, where he remained chaplain to the students. And his first book, from 1954 to 1964, he is an academic. Love and Responsibility. He did more to apply the biblical teachings on marriage than any other theologian in the 20th century. He elevated marriage. He didn't see marriage as a second best choice. He even talked about marital sexual relations as a fulfillment of scriptural and biblical responsibility, which is pretty amazing for a celibate priest, but he did.
Why are you so popular?
One of the reasons. And he was willing to talk about anything. And he would listen, and the students who kept, even after they graduated, they got married. He performed weddings. Then he would baptize their children. They stayed as a community in touch with him and in touch with each other. The Catholic University of Lublin was the only Catholic university behind the Iron Curtain. And he began as a lecturer and eventually became a professor and eventually the head of the department. The Department of Ethics by 1956, full professor in 1960. He stayed on the faculty until 1978. He only stopped teaching at this university because he was elected pope. Until his 25 years of continuous academic involvement. But he also kept his chaplaincy of the university students in Krakow for the whole time. Supervised numerous master's and doctoral theses, mentored a generation of Polish philosophers and theologians. And they all stayed in touch with him. So he moves from being a priest, an organizer of Catholic study groups and communities who support each other, an organizer of student trips and student training, and then teaching students of philosophy and theology. In 1958, he was appointed auxiliary bishop of Krakow. Now, an auxiliary bishop is kind of like a vice bishop. They don't really have the complete authority. They don't have the office. And there were 4 auxiliary bishops in Krakow. It was the large diocese. But it put him on the inside, and he became sort of part of the staff of the Archbishop of Krakow, very close. And of course, the Archbishop had been his mentor since the days of the Nazi occupation. Sapieha was still the Archbishop of Krakow. And he was appointed auxiliary bishop while he was on a kayaking trip with students. Somebody had to figure out where he was, and they sent somebody in a car at a bridge to flag him down and say, "Hey, you need to come back to Krakow. You're the new auxiliary bishop." So he did. They hitchhiked. They caught a wagon load of hay and then a milk truck, and they eventually got to a train station, got to Krakow. He got ordained. Then he went back and rejoined the kayak trip, which I think tells you something important. I think that's a note about who he was and where his interests were, and his commitment to the relationships with the people that he had been mentoring. He was Poland's youngest bishop. He was 38, which is a remarkably young age to be given this kind of responsibility. The communist authorities were not happy, but the Polish church was relatively strong because the overwhelming majority of the Polish population were still members of the church, were still active, attending members. And so there was not much the communist authorities could do about it. They wanted somebody older and more manageable, and this guy was a loose cannon. They didn't know what he was going to do. They kind of knew he'd been skirting around the edges of some of the regulations and doing things he wasn't supposed to be doing, but they couldn't really ever complain because he's just going hiking and skiing and kayaking with university students. I mean, what's wrong with that? But the appointment marked the beginning of his public role as a defender of the church and human rights in Krakow. 4 years later, Pope John the 23rd called an ecumenical council in Rome, And I missed this. I mean, I remember growing up and hearing in the 60s about Vatican II, and the biggest change for the Catholics was now the liturgy was translated from Latin into the vernacular. Before Vatican II, everywhere around the world, all the masses were conducted in Latin. After Vatican II, they could be conducted in the local language. That was the biggest change practically. But the council met for 62, 63, 64, so over 4 years. And like all the other ecumenical councils in the history of the church, the Pope had summoned every bishop in the world to come to Rome. Now, they only came for about 2 months each year. They met for 2 months in the fall each year over 4 years to deal with the issues of the time. Pope John the 23rd said his intention was to renew the church and for it to reformulate its presentation of the gospel for the modern age. This is just after World War II in the experience of all of these people. And the first half of the 20th century had not been a good century. So 2,000 bishops, there were only 2,500 bishops in the world, 2,000 of them came to Rome. So it's a far bigger event than I had been aware. And they met and they debated and they drafted position papers. And guess who was circulating and meeting and building networks and drafting a lot of the documents that were being debated and participating in the refinement and the editing and in the final vote? The bishop from Krakow. He was an active participant. We have some of the speeches that he gave, some of the addresses that he made. Of course, it's only 2 months of the year. So in between, he's going back to Krakow and then coming back to Rome for the 2-month meeting of all the bishops. But it's 2,000. They set up galleries in St. Peter's down both sides of the main aisle, and 2,000 bishops. It's an amazing event. I had no idea. 1964, his mentor, Cardinal Archbishop Sapieha, died. And to the surprise of almost everybody in Poland, the Pope, it was now Pope Paul VI, who had met him at the Vatican II meetings, appointed him Archbishop of Krakow. He's only 44. And now he is the second highest ranking churchman in Poland. The Archbishop of Warsaw is the only one who has seniority over him. In 1967, 3 years later, he's appointed to the College of Cardinals, again by Pope Paul VI, who knew of his work at Vatican II, had met him and exchanged ideas, and everybody marked out the fact this guy is a brilliant theologian. This guy is extremely well-read. This guy has a gift of languages. He has a gift of drama. He has a gift of speaking. And he has a way of building relationships. We have seen that in his work in Poland, building relationships with students and taking the gospel in places that you don't expect, and winning the hearts of his parishioners and the students and the people in his diocese. So he's now a cardinal and archbishop, and that brings us to 1978. So the Pope who had appointed him archbishop and then elevated him with the title of cardinal was Pope Paul VI, and Giovanni Battista Enrico Antonio Maria Montini died in August of 1978 after having been Pope for 15 years. And there he is meeting with Karol Wojtyla, the Bishop of Krakow. And so there's a meeting of all the cardinals. They come to Rome in September, and they elect on August 26th, they elect the Bishop of Venice, Albino Luciani, who takes the name Pope John Paul, and actually puts John Paul I in his official title, as if he had some premonition of things. And he chooses John and Paul as his names because the previous two popes had been John the 23rd and Paul VI. So he wanted to honor both of the popes that he had known and served with. So he took the name Pope John Paul I, elected Pope August 26th. And 32 days later, the nuns came into the papal apartment and discovered that he had passed away in his sleep the night before. He was Pope for 33 days. And so all the cardinals are called back. And the Cardinal Bishop of Krakow was one of the ones who elected him in August. And now it takes 8 ballots. There are 2 Italian bishops, neither of whom can get to a majority. They go through 4 or 5 ballots, and one was a supporter of Vatican II, one was kind of resisting Vatican II. And somebody said, what about the guy from Poland? We all know him. We've all heard him. He's clearly brilliant. He clearly knows what it takes to be a parish priest and to be a bishop. What about this guy? So on the 8th ballot in October of 1978, he's elected Pope. And some of his friends, one nun whom he had known in Poland, said she had been praying that they would not choose him Pope. Everybody else was hoping that they would. And she says, we can't afford to lose him. If he's elected Pope, he won't come back to Poland. So, yeah, 1978. And he is 58 years old. It's astonishingly young for someone to be elected Pope. So, now we're going to talk about his papacy. Let me see how am I doing on time.
Don't look at it.
Yeah, I know. I want to know so I can pace myself a little bit. And my phone is being obstreperous. Okay, I got 15 minutes. We're good. So I want to talk about the papacy in 3 scenes. This is Act 5. This is the second half of his life, or the third quarter of his life. And 3 scenes: the liberator, the teacher, and the suffering witness. So let's talk. There's a lot here. In the first 12 years of his papacy, he made 47 international pilgrimages, apostolic visits. In his first year, he went to the Dominican Republic and Mexico in January, Poland in June, Ireland and the USA in October, and Turkey in November. And this just kicks off the first year. He eventually becomes the most traveled pope in the history of the church. 149 countries. He visited and appeared. A number of people have said in the history of humanity, in the 4,000 years of the human race on the planet, he's probably the person who was seen by the largest number of people personally ever in the history of the world. Something like 130 million people saw him in a meeting. Just amazing. We'll talk more about the trip to Poland here in just a minute. The next year, Africa, Zaire, Congo, Kenya, and 3 other countries in May. In June, he makes an apostolic visit to France. In July, he makes an apostolic visit to Brazil. In November, he makes an apostolic visit to West Germany. And he does this every year, 4 or 5. There's one year he makes 7 apostolic visits, but almost every year it's at least 4. And he is a master of the stage, the appearance, the speeches. He writes all his own speeches, and delivers messages that are exhortations and calls to peace and kindness and love, and a renewal of the devotion to the teachings of Jesus and to a study of the Bible. He makes 3 apostolic visits to Poland in the first 10 years of his papacy. And as you might expect, the communist government in Poland is not pleased about this because he draws huge crowd. He's their favorite son, of course, and everybody wants to see our Polish Pope. One of the first visits he makes in his first year in 1979, and after his visit in 1979, 1 year later, workers in Gdansk organized an independent trade union and went on strike. This is solidarity. 10 million workers in Poland joined Solidarity. There are only 30 million workers in Poland altogether. And it was because of his visit. Several people I've seen filmed interviews of people who went to the rally, the largest rallies ever in the history of Poland. 1 million people gathered in Warsaw to hear him preach and celebrate a mass. And then outdoors at Nowa Huta, another 1 million people gathered on hillsides to hear him. And the overwhelming experience of people was not just that he was praying for peace, praying for the Holy Spirit to come, but one of his repeated lines was, "Be not afraid. Be not afraid." And I've seen interviews where they looked around and they go, "I didn't know there were so many other people who shared my faith, who shared my feelings of oppression by the communist government." And they're looking at each other going, "We outnumber them." John Paul is not calling for revolution. He never did. He called for the power of love, the power of the word, the power of persuasion. But he said everyone has a right. Every single person has worth and dignity. Every individual is valuable. And the best we can do for each other is to act with kindness and love towards each other. That was his message over and over and over again. And one of the results is this organization of workers. Well, didn't take long. After initially grudgingly granting them permission to get an official charter as an organization, the first independent trade union behind the Iron Curtain, not controlled by the government. In 1981, General Jaruzelski, who was the ruler of Poland, declared martial law, outlawed Solidarity, arrested its leadership. Lech Walesa had been the organizer. He had been an electrician who worked in the linen shipyard in Gdansk. Walesa was placed under house arrest. While he's under house arrest, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He had listened to, by the way, the workers in Gdansk put up pictures of John Paul. And the priests in Gdansk came and celebrated Mass with them and organized food and relief for the families of the striking workers who weren't being paid. And Walesa was adamant, we're not going to use any violence against the government, but we are going to insist on our rights. 1989, the economic situation in Poland continued to deteriorate. There were repeated riots, food riots, actually. In 1989, 8 years after martial law had been declared, the government essentially gave up and said, Solidarity has continued to exist as an underground outlawed movement. What do we got to do to get the country back together again? They were forced to legalize Solidarity and hold the first free elections. And there were only 35 seats in the House that were allowed to be contested, and they created a new upper house of 100. Solidarity won all 35 of the new seats in the House and 99 out of 100 of the seats in the new Senate. Yeah, the church offered infrastructure and legitimacy. Churches and parishes served as meeting places, communication hubs, safe places. The church was the only organization, the only structure that had any integrity and enjoyed any respect because they had resisted the communist government through all of their oppression. Pope John Paul publicly backed the movement. He received Solidarity delegations in Rome, even when they were illegal in Poland. They would come visit him. He kept stressing workers' rights, rooted in Catholic social teaching. The church helped integrate intellectuals, some of them from, that's the KOR, that's the Catholic University, with workers, broadening solidarities. And then under martial law, the church became the main sanctuary for the band union. They sheltered activists. They distributed underground literature. They organized aid for those who'd been arrested. And one of the priests in Warsaw began saying masses for the country, masses for the fatherland in Warsaw, openly supported Solidarity and criticized the regime. 1984, he was kidnapped and murdered by the secret police, which I'm not sure what they thought would happen. But of course, what happened was that he became a cause celeb and a celebrated, and eventually was canonized. The primate who had succeeded the previous archbishop in Warsaw walked a careful line, but he also consistently defended human rights and called for dialogue. John Paul made 2 more trips back to Poland. In 83 and 87, massive demonstrations of support for solidarity. 1 million people come to the square in Warsaw again. And even though solidarity has been outlawed, people are holding solidarity signs and banners up. And there are too many of them for the government to do anything. Yeah, crowds openly displayed the banned banners during papal masses. The Vatican provided moral and diplomatic pressure on the Polish regime and on the Soviet bloc. Pope John Paul II wrote a letter to Brezhnev, doing everything he could to dissuade Brezhnev from intervening in Poland. It's a question of why the Russians did not send troops in. They never did. And nobody to this day is really completely convinced that they know the reasons, but John Paul was doing a lot of work behind the scenes. 1988, the church acted as an intermediary. They organized roundtable talks between the government and the opposition. The bishops ensured the talks remained peaceful and led to the semi-free elections of Solidarity overwhelmingly won. In June of 1989, I talked about 1978 as being an extraordinary year with things that happened that had never happened before, the year of the 3 popes. 1989 is also one of those extraordinary years, and all of the events in Europe are linked together in ways that are still not immediately obvious and still not talked about. The revolutions of 1989 were fundamentally driven by the church, both Catholic and Protestant. In Poland, the Catholic Church was at the core of the movement that brought down the Polish government. In East Germany, the Lutheran Church in Leipzig was at the core of the demonstrations that brought down the East German government. In Hungary, in Timisoara, the demonstrations there were led by a Calvinist Presbyterian minority. They tried to arrest a Calvinist pastor, and the whole town turned out and surrounded his house, and those demonstrations escalated and spread. There was this incredible ecumenical movement. All of these people actually were talking to each other across countries, and Pope John Paul was at the center of the dialogue. So in Hungary in 1989, in May, they dropped the Iron Curtain. They were the first of the Eastern Bloc countries to open their border. They opened their border with Austria. Poland, we've already talked about it. On June 4th, they won all of the elections in a landslide, 1989. East Germany, all of a sudden, the East Germans realized, hey, we're allowed to go to Hungary. It's another communist country. We can get a visa. Our government gives us permission to travel to any other communist country. We can go to Hungary. If we can get to Hungary, we can get to Austria, and we can get to West Germany. So there's a mass exodus over that summer. And there are weekly mass demonstrations in Leipzig and Berlin that are organized in the Lutheran churches. The demonstrations in Leipzig, I got to visit the church in Leipzig where these demonstrations were organized. They had 100,000 people in the last month, the last 4 meetings, 100,000 people meeting in and around the church and then marching on the secret police headquarters. Honecker was forced to resign in October. In November, the Berlin Wall fell. In November, the day after the Berlin Wall fell, the communist leader of Bulgaria was forced to resign. A week later, there was a student protest in Prague that was violently suppressed, but you couldn't put it down. They kept coming back, and in December, Václav Havel was elected president. Havel went from prison to the palace. All of these events are linked. All of these events occurred in the summer and fall of 1989. And in Romania, the Timisoara protests that I talked about, the Presbyterian Calvinist pastor, spread to Bucharest. December 25th, Ceausescu was overthrown and executed, and the Iron Curtain had collapsed. All in 1989. And at the core of all of this, really John Paul's pilgrimages to Poland. They sort of began the fire that eventually blazed up in all these countries. So what does he do after? Okay, we've won the Cold War, now what do I do? Well, yeah, what do you do for your encore? He continued his record-breaking trips, 50 countries in the decade. He continued to write and to issue papal proclamations, a strong defense of life, human dignity, the traditional teachings that pushed back against the secularism of the 20th century. He improved relations with other religious denominations, Orthodox, Protestants, Jews, and even Muslims. He was working very hard to open a dialogue with Muslim countries. It was a very famous anecdote, I'll tell you, because it made me laugh out loud. He organized an ecumenical service in Rome at a Lutheran church that he attended. And he got, of course, he's the Pope. He can give special exception permission for whatever he wants to give. And so 2 Lutheran bishops were at the altar on either side of him celebrating communion, Mass, together. And afterwards, somebody asked him and says, "You're being at the altar with those 2 Lutheran bishops. Does that mean you recognize the validity of their orders as bishops?" And he looked over at the reporter and kind of smiled, and he said, "Maybe the 2 bishops were recognizing me as the head of the church." Didn't say anything else. But that also gives you a little bit of a clue, I think, as to his personality. By the end of the 90s, his health had begun to decline. He had multiple surgeries. He was visibly getting frail, yet he maintained a punishing schedule. He had been wounded in an assassination attempt in 1981. He had been shot in a public appearance in the square in front of St. Peter's. And miraculously, his life was saved. He was rushed to the hospital, and it took about a month for him to recover. Within 6 weeks, Ronald Reagan was also wounded in an assassination attempt. I'll talk more about the bond. They met after both had been wounded, and each declared to the other, "I think God saved our lives for a purpose." Each of them made that observation. He began to focus on the Jubilee year of 2000 as a new springtime for the church. I got to visit Rome in December of 2000. Were you guys with me on that trip? No? Different trip. I got to visit Rome. We were in line because there was a line to get into St. Peter's, and it was serpentine through the square there. And all of a sudden, the crowd started bustling and murmuring and talking, big hustle, and several people looked up, and John Paul II had come out on the balcony and was blessing all of us waiting in line to go into St. Peter's. So, for what it's worth, I was blessed by the Pope.
He recognized you.
For what? Yeah, he did. Oh, there's a guy in a red hat down there. Yeah, that was me. So yeah, he made a pilgrimage to the Middle East in 2000. Earlier that year, he had been to Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. It's just astonishing. He's 81 at this point. He visited Greece, the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. In 2002, he summoned the American cardinals to Rome to deal with clergy abuse. And in 2002, he made a final trip to Poland. 2003, he opposed the Iraq War. He attempted to mediate peace unsuccessfully. 2004, he celebrated 25 years since his election in 1978. And 2005, he published a final book and died in April. 1 month after his death, his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, who was Cardinal Ratzinger, German bishop, who had been a very close ally and supporter, began the process of canonization. Usually there's a 5-year waiting period after someone dies before you can begin. He waived that. At his funeral in the Vatican, the crowd, the Italians loved him, by the way, because he addressed them in Italian. He's the first pope to come out after his election from the balcony and not deliver a speech in Latin. He delivered a speech in Italian. Anyway, the crowd was chanting Santo Subito, which is saint now, saint immediately. 2009, Pope Benedict declared him venerable. 2011, he was beatified, and in 2014, canonized by Pope Francis. Benedict had resigned rather than staying in the office, and the reasons for his resignation are still not entirely clear. I think part of it was he had seen the decline in John Paul II's health, and the difficulty that caused when John Paul was no longer able to really administer the office day to day. And so he resigned, but he was still alive. 2014, he attended the ceremony where John Paul II was declared to be a saint. President Bush, George W. Bush, in 2005, the Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom and a good and faithful servant of God has been called home. Even got a kind word from Bill Clinton. Holy Father was a beacon of light, not just for Catholics, but for all people. UK Prime Minister, he never wavered, never flinched in the struggle for what he thought was good and right. German Chancellor wrote history. Pope John Paul II wrote history. By his efforts and through his impressive personality, he changed our world. Without him, there would have been no end of communism, or at least much later, and the end would have been bloody. And Ariel Sharon, he was a man of peace, a friend of the Jewish people who recognized its uniqueness and worked for reconciliation. He's the first pope to visit a synagogue. He visited the synagogue in Rome. All right, well, I went 5 minutes over, but I hope that was kind of worth it. I had to leave out just an incredible amount of stuff. I'll get to go back and talk about some of these events in the next 2 lectures because I want to talk about Margaret Thatcher and about Ronald Reagan in August and September. But I hope you got a sense now of who this guy was, how he became Pope, and what he accomplished in his 25 years as Pope, as the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, but also someone who embraced all of the Christians of the world. He really very much was, had an ecumenical spirit and looked for reconciliation and points of commonality. I have here he rewrote the liturgy for the Stations of the Cross, which are observed at Easter. And there had been a lot of legendary material that had crept into the traditional service. He rewrote all of the texts and prayers for the Stations of the Cross to make sure that each of the stations had a biblical text at its foundation. And I've used it here at ALC. We did it one Easter. We did the Stations of the Cross here with the texts that were written by John Paul. So, questions, comments, reactions? What did you learn? What's the most surprising thing you learned that you didn't expect? What did you find surprising in all of this fire hose of information?
That he was such an influence on politics
Yeah.
without actually coming out.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah.
So, John Paul the First, had he been ill?
Yeah. Yeah. He had congestive heart failure. He was not in good health. Not very many people knew it, but it was not really a surprise to those who were closest to him. They knew he was in failing health when he was elected Pope. In fact, he's quoted as saying at the conclave where he was elected, asked if he would accept, and he said, "I will, but may God forgive you for what you've just done." He didn't expect to be Pope for long. And by all accounts, he was a bishop much like John Paul II. He had won a reputation as bishop in Venice as being someone who cared about parish ministries, small groups, supporting families. He was similar in his background and his approach to the life of the church. Had a very good reputation, was very popular with the people in his diocese. So. All right. Well, I hope you'll come back next month, second Tuesday, August 11th. We'll talk about the Iron Lady.